Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this special presentation by the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music at Monmouth University. I am Melissa Ziobro, the curator of the Springsteen Archives and a history professor here at Monmouth University, just a mile from the beach in beautiful West Long Branch, New Jersey. Tonight, we are going to be chatting with New Jersey historian Paulie Wenger about the movie Sinners and its historical tie to the New Jersey Pine Barrens. But first, you've got to give me just a minute to tell you a little bit about the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music while I have you here as a captive audience. If you are not super familiar with our work, we are located, as I said, at Monmouth University, just a mile from the beach and just up the road from famed Asbury Park. Our mission is twofold. We preserve the legacy of Bruce Springsteen. We are his official repository, but we also celebrate the history of American music in all its diversity of artists and genres with our exhibits, publications, and programming like this evening. We already have a presence at Monmouth University, but we are in the midst of building a brand new 30,000 square foot facility, which is scheduled to open on the campus of Monmouth about a year from now in the spring or early summer of 2026. Our new facility will feature roughly 10,000 square feet of exhibits on American music history, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, a 250-seat state-of-the-art theater, gift shop, and more. So we cannot wait for you to come and visit us next year. You can see more about our work on our social media and on our website, springsteenarchives.org. You can also donate on our website if you are so inclined, because we are a 501c3. So thanks for giving me a minute to provide that little intro. And now let's get into tonight. Our event overview. Music plays a haunting role in Ryan Coogler's 2025 horror hit Sinners, where sound serves as a conduit not just to the divine, but to something far darker. But long before the film's release, the Pine Barrens of New Jersey had its own tale of supernatural music. So in tonight's talk, Pine Barrens historian Paulie Wenger will explore the life and lore of Sammy Giberson, the legendary fiddler whose talent was said to rival and perhaps even outmatch the devil himself. Paulie, who's joining us this evening, is pursuing his PhD in history at the University of Delaware. Hailing from Burlington County, Paulie is very proud of his Piney background. His writing has appeared in Stockton University's SoJourn journal and Weird N.J magazine. I'm jealous about that. I've not published in Weird N.J yet. It's on my to-do list. Paulie is also the president of the Pemberton Township Historic Trust. So I'm going to turn things over to Paulie, who is going to both educate and delight us with this tale, and then we'll have time for some Q&A at the end.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I feel that before I share my screen, I feel I must say it feels a little bit sacrilege that I'm zooming in from Newark, Delaware to talk about Pine Barrens history. So pardon me for that area as we get started here. So if I can share my screen and have that look all good. Wonderful. As Melissa said, it is so nice to meet you all. My name is Paulie Wenger, and I was raised in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. For those of you that are inclined to folklore of the Pine Barrens, I was actually raised in Ongs Hat in Burlington County, which has a long and complicated folklore legend all of its own. But we will leave that for another time. As a historian hailing from the Pine Barrens, I am fascinated in the folklore around the area that we grew up in. Much of the tales and much of the people who we're going to talk about today are only within, a 15-minute drive of where I grew up. So this is a topic that is really important to me in my historical background, but also personally important to me because of where I grew up. So, besides my interest in doing history, I'm also really interested in one other thing, and that is horror movies. So, you guys can imagine my surprise when my most anticipated horror movie of 2025 was Ryan Coogler's Sinners. This is a horror movie that was set during one fateful night in a segregated Mississippi. For those of you that haven't seen it, and apologies for some minor spoilers, but for the most part, it was advertised that we're going to connect these two movies. Sinners follows a young black musician named Sammy in 1932 Mississippi, who during one traumatizing night in a segregated juke joint plays a forbidden song that connects him to his ancestors, but also draws forth the supernatural in the form of an ancient vampire. It doesn't get a lot cooler than old timey music in this kind of weird situation plot and vampires. The film blurs the line between the physical and the spiritual and the effect of music. Also, it touches on things like generational trauma, all set to a really interesting soundtrack that's as riveting as it is haunting. I absolutely loved this movie. It's so scary, it's so thrilling, but it's also filled with a ton of references to real folklore and history. While Sinners focuses more on original characters such as the vampire Remick, it draws on a number of folklore concerning musicians who have either battled or gained their powers through malevolent supernatural forces. And by powers, I mean their musical prowess. Of course, America has a long tradition of musicians who supposedly had met the devil or gained their powers through that avenue. Let's roll through a couple of these. One example, Jimi Hendrix, widely regarded as the most innovative and influential electric guitarist in rock history, once said that he felt possessed while playing. His tour manager, Alan Douglas, later recalled about the legendary musician, stating, "One of the biggest things about Jimmy was what he believed in. He believed that he was possessed by some spirit, and I came to believe it too." Then there's Ferdinand Jelly Roll Morton, famous for publishing the first jazz composition, whose musical prowess, one legend claimed, originated from his French-speaking Creole grandmother who practiced voodoo, the legend says, and offered his soul in a black magic ritual in exchange for musical fame. You can see on the right of the screen an image by Robert Crumb that is kind of memorializing this folklore legend about Jelly Roll Morton. How about more recently, right? This week, we lost a music icon in Ozzy Osbourne, who has long had rumors connecting him to the devil during, he was a target for the satanic panic of the 1980s. And it didn't matter to many people that Osbourne was raised in the Church of England or stated that he used to pray before every show. Once these stories take hold, it's very hard to dispel. In fact, the image that you see on the screen, I found this article that came out, and you'll see on the screen, July 23rd, 2025. So these things are still very much thought about today. Though, if we're talking about musicians who supposedly met, the devil or some supernatural force, the most famous example comes in the name of Robert Leroy Johnson. This is the Mississippi bluesman who supposedly met the devil at the crossroads, traded his soul for his talent, and died mysteriously at the age of 27. His short life, eerie recordings, and legendary deal are all baked into American music mythology. And, of course, he is the most direct inspiration, in my opinion, and also what Ryan Coogler has said, for the movie Sinners. And of course, who could forget that fateful moment when the devil went down to Georgia? Charlie Daniels' 1979 song, written only when the band realized they were missing a song featuring a fiddle, has probably done the most work to perpetuate stories of musicians meeting the old one. But here in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, and I should say I'm in Newark, but those of us that are from the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, we don't need to look all that far. We don't need to look too far south to find a musician who is tangled with the devil. I think it's fair to say that for those of us that were raised in the Pine Barrens, we aren't scared of any devils. Okay, maybe one devil. Maybe we're scared of one devil. But we in the Pines have at least one musician who could stand up to the old one. A fiddler whose playing could charm bears, outduel city folk, and maybe, just maybe, stare down the devil himself. I am speaking, of course, of Sammy Giberson. But before we get into Sammy himself, we need to meet the historian who helped preserve his legend. Now, I know exactly what you guys are thinking, right? You just had us talking about voodoo, the devil, and fiddle duels, and now you want us to care about some stuffy professor? Yes, I absolutely do. We will get back to Sammy and his exploits in just a minute here. So let me introduce everyone here to Herbert Halpert. In 1936, as a Columbia undergrad in New York, studying the dying art of American folk songs, Herbert caught wind of an isolated group of people living in some general direction south of Trenton, so called Pineys, who might still be singing songs and telling stories unknown to the outside world. Halpert had been in New York looking for all these stories, and he actually recorded something, I believe, like 200 or 300 songs, but he was starting to run out of material to record. So he heard about these folks living in southern New Jersey and thought, maybe there's some songs or some stories that are still waiting to be heard. So, likely inspired by Henry Charlton Beck's Forgotten Towns of Southern New Jersey, which was released in 1936, Halpert loaded up a recording machine and he drove to Burlington County. What he found wasn't just songs, but instead a whole culture teetering on the edge of vanishing. At that time, the Pine Barrens were still isolated, right? People still made a living picking cranberries and huckleberries, building boats, making charcoal, weaving baskets, or gathering sphagnum moss. Some, such as Asa Pittman of Mount Misery, even sold rattlesnakes to carnivals or zoos across the world. And I absolutely love this picture of Asa Pittman holding a snake that you'll see on the right. But this world was changing. Paved roads were making it easier for outsiders to visit. Radios and movie theaters were seeping into the pines. And when Fort Dix was built, obliterating some of the towns in the Pine Barrens, Halpert saw a culture that was beginning to fragment. Now, when Halpert first arrived in the Pine Barrens, he was not successful. We need to make that very clear. His initial meeting with the Pine Barrens did not go very well. Most towns, what would happen, he describes it in his later writings in his dissertation, is that he would go into a town and he would stop and he would say, am I in the Pine Barrens? Are these Pineys? Are you guys Pineys? And they would say to him, no, this is not the Pineys, the Pine Barrens. We're not Pineys. You need to go a little further down the road. So then Halpert would get back in his car and he'd drive a little further down the road and he would get out and he'd say, are these the Pine Barrens? Are you all Pineys? And he would hear the same thing again. Get in your car, drive a little further down the road. Eventually, he writes that he had crisscrossed Burlington County and entered Ocean County so much that he began to realize that most people did not really either wish to claim the term or they were kind of not necessarily buying into it as much. Now, he eventually began to have some success when he was told that he needed to meet a woman in the Pine Barrens. And this would eventually be Elizabeth White of Whitesbog in Brown's Mills. Elizabeth White obviously is famous for her role in the cultivation of blueberries. And when Halpert approached her at Whitesbog, he first had to tell her that he was not a newspaperman. Apparently, that was almost akin to being a criminal at that point, and a major concern for Elizabeth White. And when he finally was able to convince her that he was not some newspaperman, but a genuinely curious student looking to hear folk songs, she finally pointed him towards a couple of her workers. That's when Halpert began collecting songs. Now, we should mention initially, when he first came in 1936, Halpert was only interested in collecting music. He wasn't really interested in collecting songs folklore or stories that people were telling. He was more so looking for the songs that people could sing. And I'll give you an example here in just a second. So I want to share really quick one of the recordings that Herbert Halpert actually recorded during this visit to the Pine Barrens. So I'm going to bring it across the screen. And this is actually at Indiana University. They have his entire collection of music that he recorded and eventually folklore that he recorded while he was there. So this is a very short 1 minute clip that I'd like to play for you all so you guys can get a feel for exactly what he was recording and what it actually sounded like. And I believe it should
My name is Charles Henry Grant. I was born on the first day of April, 1868. I'm an April Fool.
Where do you live now, Charles?
Me, I live in New Eden. It's a great little town.
I'm glad you like it.
Yeah.
But what is this that you're going to sing?
I'm going to sing you now a little ring play. We used to play when I was a boy.
How old a boy?
Oh, 8, 10 years old.
When you were small, when did you play when you were real small?
Oh, yeah.
What's the name of it?
Why, Two Jolly Sailor Boy.
All right.
Yeah, and I want you to play this over for me after I sing it because we'll get it better than I can.
Okay.
There stands two boys, two jolly, jolly boys, just fleet like came on shore. They spend their days in very foolish ways, just as they did before. Oh, we will have another row. Row, we will have another row, and he who delights in a very pretty girl, just bring her on the floor. You know, he brought her out then and kissed her, and that settled that song.
Yeah, and then how about then the girls have...
I'll stop it there. But you guys get the general gist of what he was doing. He would go into the Pine Barrens, he would meet people who knew different songs, and he would have them play the song, or either he would have them sing the song. Sometimes he would bring in musical instruments, or they would play their musical instruments, and he would get a general feel for what the song was. These are songs, many of which, if they were not recorded, likely would have not been preserved to today, including things like, Hard Times at the Mount Holly Jail, which is about the Mount Holly Jail. This is what Herbert Halpert would do. Now, the research that he eventually did would follow him from his role at Columbia towards his PhD work at the University of Indiana. His dissertation, which focused on the folklore and the folk songs of New Jersey, is highly readable and worth checking out if you're interested in any of this. I want to shout out a friend of mine because it's a little bit difficult to find his dissertation. You can request it from Indiana University, but it's a super long file. It's almost 700 pages long. So I want to shout out my friend Paul Shop, who lent me his copy of the 2010 book you see on the screen, which is includes much of the transcripts and the notes that Halpert took between 1936 and 1951. It's from these stories and these recordings that we know much of the legends about that fiddle player, Sammy Giberson. So let's get into him a little bit. Now, according to the family Bible of Sammy's oldest daughter, Mary Van Arsdale, Sammy Giberson was born on September 16, 1808, likely on the border between Burlington and Ocean County. His daughter, Ella Frances, claimed that to Halpert that Sammy may have been born in either Barnegat, Manahawkin, or Tuckerton, due to the proximity of her relatives in the area. And this would make sense, as Little Egg Harbor at that point and when he was born would have been considered part of Burlington County. And now, of course, it's part of Ocean County. Giberson was relatively short, standing about 5'6", weighing 150 pounds. He had brown hair, but from reports, family interviews and things, he had the general toughness of someone raised in the backwoods. While little is known about his life in the Pines, it can be inferred that his family was not particularly wealthy. One family story told to Halpert was that when Sammy's wife, Anne, used to visit the grandchildren, she would tell stories of burning a twisted string in a saucer of lard for lights. Only later on in their marriage did they finally switch to tallow candles. Whatever their circumstances, between 1833 and 1858, Sammy and Anne bore 11 children, 6 boys, including a pair of twins, and 5 girls. Owing to their, I would say, general poverty, all of the children, except for the youngest, were sent to live with nearby farmers. His granddaughter, Desiree Preston, one of his granddaughters, as I said that the family would put the children out to work for their clothes and their board until they were 18 years of age. So we can kind of get a general feel of what it must have been like growing up in the Giberson family. Naturally, Sammy worked as a charcoal maker in the pines. Stories of his brushes with nature are rife. One family legend claimed that he killed a bear with an axe, back when bears were still a relative commonality in the Pine Barrens, while another claimed that he would dispatch all snakes except pine snakes. One of his sons later said, "Only pine snakes. He didn't like to kill them. He said that it was foolish to be afraid of a pine snake. He'd put it right over his shoulder and around his neck." Now, when the Civil War broke out, family legends say that Giberson was really interested in joining the Union Army, but apparently he had a large cyst on his back that would hinder his ability to actually join. Instead, 3 of his sons, John, David, and Miller, went instead. Of course, owing to his later legendary status as a fiddler, there are stories about why Sammy Giberson didn't end up in the military. John Winsky from Lakehurst in 1946 remarked about his experience during the American Civil War, stating that when he was being taken to Trenton to be examined for the Army, he began laughing as hard as humanly possible. The men marching with him couldn't figure out why. When he finally paused through labored breaths, he turned to the men and he wheezed out, "Look at that hind wheel of that buggy trying to catch up to the little one in front." With that, the other men looked at him, told him that he was crazy, and to get out of line and go home. The legend goes that Sammy Giberson continued to follow the line of soldiers, but eventually he lost track of them, soon returning home to the Pine Barrens, where he would spend the duration of the war. Now, of course, that's a humorous story, and we know from family interviews that didn't happen, but it plays into the stories that Giberson likely told about himself. And you can see an image of the different size wheels on a wagon. But most of all, Sammy Giberson is remembered as a master fiddler and dancer. Frank Reynolds of Whiting stated that Giberson could dance a jig with a glass of water on his head and not spill a single drop. Desiree Preston once claimed to have seen Sammy Giberson put a looking glass or mirror on the floor and dance on top of it, showing how light he was on his feet. An example of Sammy's musical talent can best be seen, or not even necessarily best, but can be seen in the story about Giberson's Bee Song, which was reported by Desiree Preston in Trenton in 1946. This story followed Sammy chopping a load of wood near his house to use for charcoal making. As he was cutting the logs, he heard a strange noise, a buzzing sound emanating from a nearby tree. Sammy was enthralled by that sound, and he went home that night, deciding to learn how to play the sound on the violin. Preston claimed to have heard the song many times, and apparently it was quite the buzz around town. However, Sammy's most famous piece is called the air tune, also sometimes called the ear tune. Some, such as Clarence Webb of Browns Mills, claim that Sammy learned it while walking home across a bridge to Hanover from a nearby hoedown in a neighboring town, when he stopped and heard a melody carrying on the breeze. He listened, pulled out his fiddle, and played the music on the spot. It eventually became his signature piece, a song so beautiful that legends say that it brought their listeners to tears. Many offered that the song was always played at the end of his shows. But others say that the tune came from darker origins. According to a Betsy Bell of Collier's Mill, Sammy once met the devil on a lonely road after a party. They struck a deal, a contest to see who could fiddle and who could dance better than the other. In some versions, Sammy wins, playing so sweetly that the devil dances his legs down to the knees. In others, the devil outplays Sammy, splitting his violin strings in half, and while Giberson struggled to keep up. One version of the story from Ivans McKelvey says that the devil told Sammy that he could go home only if he played a tune that the devil had never heard before. Sammy then pulled a tune from the air, and the devil, stunned, said to him, "Well, I never heard that one before. Go ahead and go home." Another one of these stories comes from Charles H. Grant of New Egypt in 1940, which described a similar story to these other ones, but stated that the devil only arrived after Sammy told another fiddler named Bill Dennis, "Yeah, I can beat you or any man I've ever seen dancing or fiddling either. I think I can even beat the devil." When approached by the devil across that bridge, they had their duel, and Sammy soon learned that he was outmatched. Submitting to the devil, he turned to the beast and he said, "You can beat me at playing or dancing. You're now the only man I've ever seen that could do it." Satisfied, the story goes, they both walked away. Now, Grant claimed that Sammy Giberson only met the devil one more time following that night, but this is another really interesting story. In New York, Sammy met a woman who completely outperformed him both in dancing and fiddling. Not believing that he could have been bested twice, especially, of course, by a woman, Sammy claimed that she was the devil and that had come again to test him. When he brought home the violin gifted to him by that talented woman, who seemingly took the accusation as a positive, Grant claimed that the townsfolk thought that Sammy Giberson was crazy. They could believe the first devil story, but not that the devil could turn into a woman. In all of these stories about Giberson's meetings with the devil, only in two versions do we get any description of the devil, which is not all that different from our state cryptid in the Jersey Devil. In one story, its hands are described as clubby, while he has claws in the other, and also it's said that he had a clawed foot, and is dressed in black, either the usual color, either in his skin or in his clothes. And I forgot to mention, I brought with me, as we're talking, my little stuffed Jersey Devil little guy. So I don't know if he saw our Jersey Devil, but I think most people just assumed the general devil. Other stories of Giberson's supernatural exploits are littered throughout the oral histories that Halpert collected. Oliver Minnie of Cookstown in 1941 claimed that his father once saw Sammy turn a key on his fiddle so that no other person could play a sound. Sammy then turned to Minnie's father, according to this story, stating that he couldn't dance better than my little brown jug. To this, Sammy began playing a tune called The Little Brown Jug, as the jug sprang to life and continued as long as he played. Following the song, Sammy turned to Minnie's father, asking him to have a drink with him, and the poor man was so spooked that apparently he never took a drink again. Another story by Mrs. Charles Parker of New Lisbon in 1941 claimed that Giberson made a deal with the devil while laid out mortally sick on his deathbed. Following their game, the devil said to Sammy, "Well, I've come to take you." To this, Sammy responded, "Will you let me live till this candle burns out?" The old devil then says, "Sure, you can last until this candle burns out." And Sammy, thinking on his feet, immediately blew out the candle, preserving it until it was lit again, and thereby saving his life. And I've put on the screen here a couple interesting items throughout New Jersey. Now, Giberson's death and burial is largely still kind of up in the air. We know exactly how he died, but the exact circumstances are hard to pin down. Mostly this is due to a lack of sources. Halpert, in his studies of Sammy, was only given a worn and undated newspaper clipping describing Giberson's burial in an old graveyard someplace in Ocean County. Ultimately, however, he was able to find Giberson's death certificate. And I do need to shout out my friend Tim McCorston at the State Archives, who was able to get me a copy of the death certificate. And it lists his death as August 28th, 1884, from bowel consumption. You'll actually see it down here at the bottom. The cause of death is bowel consumption. It also includes a number of really interesting information here. You'll see His occupation at the top is listed as violinist. You'll see his full name, Samuel Gordon Giberson, and his age is listed at 79 years. There's also where he was born, which is Burlington County. You'll see right there, Burlington County, New Jersey. His last place of residence, which is Manchester. And also at the bottom, and we'll get to this, some information about where exactly he was buried. This question of Sammy Giberson's burial was really important to Halpert, as the stories of Sammy's legendary life did not stop following his death. Stacy Bozarth of Budtown told Halpert that some had said that the fiddle that Giberson used continued to play a tune even once it was included in his casket. Others, such as Betsy Bill of Collier's Mill, said that the fiddle disappeared completely after Giberson had died, never to be heard from again. Of course, we know these stories aren't necessarily true. Members of Giberson's family refuted them in the interviews themselves, stating that, he had multiple violins, and some of those they had either sold or given away in the years after his death. After tracking down Giberson's children and great-grandchildren, Halpert eventually located the place of Giberson's burial. In Whiting, there was a small group of houses known as Giberson's Mill, though the road to these houses no longer exists. You'll see a picture right here on the left of Giberson's Mill. I have not been there myself to prove if there are still buildings, but from what I can tell, those buildings are no longer there. Apparently, there was also a small church there known as Giberson's Church, and you'll see that at the bottom of the death notice. It actually says where he was buried, Giberson Church. Now, when Halpert actually went to this site, he claimed to have found the actual church and the graveyard, and in that graveyard, he claimed to have found the gravestone of Sammy Giberson's wife, Anne. And it said Anne Giberson, the wife of Sammy Giberson, but he did not find Sammy Giberson's actual gravestone. Now, this isn't necessarily anything groundbreaking, because family members of Giberson later told Halpert that, yes, he is buried there. There's a headstone for Anne. There is no headstone for Sammy Giberson. And his writings about finding Sammy's burial place, he had such trouble trying to find it, because every person that he asked, where is Sammy Giberson buried, would tell him a different location. They would say, no, he was absolutely buried in Hanover. He was buried in Brown's Mills. And then eventually he was able to track down, not only through this death notice, but also through family members, including his great-grandson, James Giberson, where exactly he was. There's a couple other things I should point out about this death notice. As we mentioned, bowel consumption was the cause of death, and it said that the length of illness was 10 days. There are family stories that Giberson was on his way to go to another fiddling event when he sat down by a stream and ended up passing out from his illness, and that would lead to his cause of death. How true those stories are, like any oral history, it's very hard to say, but it is really interesting to find this document, which not only lists his occupation as violinist, but also have all of this information as well. Stories about stories from Stacy Bozarth, he actually says about Samuel Giberson, he says he always said he was going to play the fiddle until he beat the devil playing it. And maybe he did. Or maybe the devil is still out there, still looking for someone who could play that old tune. Now, for much of Halpert's work about Sammy Giberson, and we heard a very small amount of the stories that people told about Giberson, a lot of what Halpert did was trying to uncover where these stories came from. According to Halpert, violinist, more than any other type of musician, seemed to attract legends, especially legends about the devil. As Halpert wrote in his dissertation, apparently at that time, he wrote, "In this country among church folk, it is a common saying that the devil's in the fiddle." In fact, Halpert believe that many of the stories he collected about New Jersey, including those about Sammy Giberson, can be directly traced to older European traditions. He found two main themes that connected the fiddler stories. First, he said there was a long tradition of showmanship, tricks used by violinists to wow an audience. We're talking things like playing after removing multiple strings, imitating animal sounds, or holding the violin in an unusual acrobatic position. Many of the stories about Giberson said that he could play the fiddle behind his back, or that he could do a whole dance while playing his fiddle. And second, and perhaps most important, is the idea that violinists gain their powers through a relationship with the supernatural. Often that meant the devil, and this tradition spans centuries, and some of the most famous violinists in history were wrapped up in this similar type of story. So let's start with Giuseppe Tartini. He was born in 1692, and he was an Italian violinist and composer who claimed that he once dreamed that he made a pact with the devil. In that dream, the devil became his servant, and at one point picked up Tartini's violin and played the most beautiful sonata that he had ever heard. Tartini was overwhelmed and said that he could hardly breathe from the emotion of the song. Now, when he awoke, he grabbed his own violin and tried to recreate the melody. And when he wrote down became his most famous work, the Sonata di Diavolo, or also known as the Devil's Sonata. Tartini later confessed that while the piece was the best that he'd ever composed, it was still a pale imitation of the music he heard in that dream. He even said that he would have smashed his violin in despair if it weren't for the joy that playing still gave him. That story of a tune pulled from a dream, gifted by the devil, feels eerily similar to Sammy Giberson. The idea of sometimes he learns the song from the devil, or playing against the devil, he pulls a song from the air. It seems a little similar. Now, the next one we should talk about is Niccolo this is a tough one. Paganini. Paganini was born a century later in 1782 and became one of the most celebrated violinists in the world. He didn't just play the violin, though. Legends say that he commanded the violin to play. His fingers moved impossibly fast, his range was otherworldly, and some said that he could make the violin sing, weep, or even imitate voices and barnyard animals. Of course, with these stories, people began to whisper, stating that his talent had to come from somewhere unholy, that he had made a deal with the devil, and one man even claimed that he saw the devil on stage standing behind Paganini while he was playing, and they said the devil was guiding his arm and controlling his bow. Of course, he denied the rumors, but of course, denying a rumor is not going to stop the rumors from happening. Even after his death, legends continued. Some people said they could still hear the sound of violin coming from the grave, and his showmanship added fuel to the fire. Paganini was famous for removing 3 of the 4 violin strings and still playing intricate compositions on just one remaining string. Stories claim that he learned this trick while imprisoned for a terrible crime, as you'll see with the picture over here on the left. Some audience believe that he was more than human, and others believe that he was the devil himself. There's even a story from Ferrara where Paganini was using his violin to imitate a braying donkey, apparently in response to a heckler in the audience. The problem, the town next door used to mock the people of Ferrara by calling them donkeys. And so the whole crowd thought he was insulting them. They all rushed to the stage, and he was only barely able to escape with his life. These tales, right? The single string, the strange sounds, the posthumous music, all of these show up again in the tales of Sammy Giberson. A third example, and our last example that we'll talk about, is Ole Bull. Ole Bull was a Norwegian violinist born in 1810, and he openly admired Paganini. Like his hero, Bull mastered the art of showmanship. He played on fewer strings, he imitated whistles and music, when I should say whistles and voices. And one time when a man whistled at him from the audience, Bull responded by playing a perfect imitation of that exact whistle back at him. Critics accused him of using tricks. One even claimed that Bull was had an accomplice waiting in the wings, pulling a second bow in secret. But it didn't matter. He was a sensation. He toured not only Europe, but America as well, and wherever he went, legends were soon to follow. One of these stories, or one of the folklore about Bull, is that some say that he made his way to New Jersey's Pine Barrens. And if you believe the local stories, some say that he crossed bows with none other than Sammy Giberson himself. Now, we don't have proof that that meeting actually occurred, but the influence of Bull and his stories, I think it's pretty apparent in the stories of Sammy Giberson. Now, Halpert believed that the stories of these artists, their tricks, their legends, all filtered down to rural areas and inspired local musicians like Giberson. The tale of Sammy playing with fewer and fewer strings, even in a duel with the devil, seems to have come directly from Paganini. But there's also the idea that maybe these originated independently of these other musicians. A particular piece that Paganini loved to perform was called Air on the G String, and it became a staple among ambitious violinists across America by the late 19th century. It involved removing all strings except for the G and playing variations on it. It's no coincidence that Giberson's most famous song is called the Air Tune, and that in some versions of the legend, he wins the fiddling match by playing a song that the devil had never heard before. Right? These aren't just stories, they're echoes from the past. They're echoes not only from earlier musicians and earlier folklore that stretch all the way from, 18th century Italy, and I'm sure they stretch back even way farther than that, to the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. So as we begin to wrap up here, I want you guys to think about, why do these stories of music and the supernatural hold such a sway over us? Right? Certainly it comes from the age-old belief that musical talent, like artistic talent, originates from something beyond the plane of our existence. But I would argue that these stories are also important because they have always remained popular in our culture. A movie like Sinners wouldn't exist without these earlier stories of Robert Johnson, these European artists and violinists, or even Sammy Giberson himself, right? These are cultural universals that continue to guide our art and our popular culture today. So the next time that someone tells you that the crossroads belongs to Mississippi, or that the devil only goes down to Georgia, remind them that our Pine Barrens has their own stories. We have our own musical tradition and our own musicians who just might be able to outplay hell itself. And that man would be Sammy Giberson. Thank you, everyone. I think we're open to some questions. Are we open to questions, Melissa?
We are. We do have some time left for questions. First of all, a round of applause for Paulie. It's always hard clapping in the virtual environment,
That's
but
true.
that was fabulous, Paulie. You are so engaging, and this was so well researched. I truly enjoyed it so much. Thank you.
I would totally say to folks, like, reading Halpert is so much fun to read. So, like, if any of you are interested in this stuff, there is so much that I just could not fit into this talk. Make sure to go check it out.
Oh, I love it. I love it. There were so many favorites in this program for me, as a former president of oral history in the Mid-Atlantic region. The idea that you were playing us recordings from the 1930s of people born in the 19th century is just floors me. And your story about the fiddle continuing to play even in the casket, right? I mean, gosh, this is Pine Barrens lore at its finest. So let me stop talking though and open the floor to Q&A. To our audience, you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you would like to type your question in the chat, I would be happy to ask it for you. So who wants to go first? give everybody a moment to type or to find their unmute button. While people are formulating their questions, let me ask you, Paul, if you can tell us a little more about how you came across Sammy Giberson's story.
Yeah, definitely. Like I kind of mentioned early on, I grew up in the area, and Sammy Giberson is central to Burlington County and Ocean County. I don't want to leave out Ocean County at all. So these are stories that you find a lot in some of our required reading growing up in the Pine Barrens, which includes Henry Charlton Beck. You have to read Henry Charlton Beck growing up, and John McPhee. John McPhee mentions him in his Pine Barrens book, and McPhee is mostly pulling from Halpert when he writes about him. So these are like, if you're growing up in the Pine Barrens and you're some nerdy kid growing up, you will run across these stories just by virtue of being around the area. In fact, Sammy Giberson's last entry into the census in 1880 lists him as living in Pemberton. And the actual census listing also lists his occupation as violinist. Now, the one question I have, and it's something that maybe one day we'll look into, is how much would he get paid for events? How much would he actually get paid to go and play at an event? And did it make up for, missing out on, making charcoal? I don't know.
Yeah, I want to know what he got paid and then adjust it for inflation and kind of, yeah, all those historian nerd things that we like to do. From the audience, questions?
Go ahead, Mark.
Hey, Paulie, how are you? Really interesting talk. In fact, just earlier this morning, I listened to The Devil Came Down from Georgia, the Charlie Daniels Band, because yesterday I bought a vinyl album called Southern Fried Rock, sorry. And of course that's on it. So I joined a little late, and I don't know if you had mentioned it, but given Melissa's background and everyone here, did you talk anything about A Night with the Jersey Devil that Springsteen did a few years ago, and how he, his obviously a well-read guy with a lot of, information about the state. Have you encountered that story, how he put that together at all?
I haven't touched on it too much. I'm actually giving a talk in October about the Jersey Devil story. So hopefully I can put it into that talk at a later point. But I wonder if Bruce has ever heard about Sammy Giberson before. I would guess probably not. Maybe he's read.
I was gonna go the other way and say I bet he has. Considering
I would like to think
love
so.
of music history and his well-readedness too. So, but I used to take my kids down to the Wharton State Park and the Jersey Devil Museum down there when they were little, and my kids had the T-shirts and everything like that. So, it was also interesting. I remember reading a book about it, that there were a lot of sightings of the Jersey Devil in Philadelphia as well.
Absolutely, the big sighting in 1909. It wasn't
just confined to the Pine Barrens. It, the story kind of spread, and so I always find that interesting too.
Well, I think I don't know, it'll be in a different spot, but if you follow me on Facebook, you'll see a link or an information about my October talk.
Okay.
And I think you'll really like it. And the one thing I will say, speaking about his air tune, Sammy Giberson's air tune, there is a recording of someone claiming to play the air tune. It's at Indiana University. I've been trying to get them to send me a copy of it for like about 3 weeks now. And I don't think it's legitimate. There was a guy who Halpert was recording named Ivans McKelvey, who claims that he was playing the air tune. But of course, he said he only heard the air tune once and when he was 8 years old. So how legitimate do we think that his recording of the air tune is? I'll leave that to the audience, but I would still like to hear it at some point.
Absolutely. Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate it.
I'm sure those hardworking archivists will get it to you eventually, Paulie.
I'll take it even after this talk is over.
Well, I think you're going to get more requests to do this talk after people saw it here tonight, because it was so great. Here's a question from Emily in the chat. Emily asks, how, as a historian, do you balance local mysticism and expand it to a national historical narrative on folk music?
Yeah, absolutely. The best part about this, Emily, is, Halpert has kind of done the work here for us a little bit. And I hate to say that we're kind of riding on his coattails, but Halpert is like the premier folklorist that I think I've read in terms of taking a lot of these stories and expanding them out to say, here's where they've been heard before, and here's kind of what they mean for the general history of it. For example, when we tell the story about Giberson, allegedly going and joining the army and seeing the two different size wheels, that is not a story that is specific to the Pine Barrens or Giberson himself. That's a story that's been heard all throughout the United States during the Civil War period. It was a popular story to tell. And so you can kind of talk about what exactly does that story mean, as opposed to how people felt during that period. The other thing I'll say is, you know this, oral history is tough, right? How do you take these stories and take them as fact, especially when a lot of these people that Halpert was recording were in their 80s or 70s or 90s that had seen Sammy Giberson when they were, 10 years old or 15 years old. And unfortunately, when you're a historian, you kind of are put into a weird spot where you want to use the history, but you have to be cognizant of the fact that memory is faulty. And so, as long as I think in your writing or in your research, you just reckon with the fact that you can never be positive when it comes to oral history, but that there's still valuable stuff in it, you should be in a good spot.
Paulie, that's a great answer to the question. And if I may, for a
Please.
sec, just because I'm so passionate about oral history, right? I teach a semester-long oral history class and do oral history workshops. And sometimes people will say, well, why is this a valid source? People could lie. They could misremember. I would say I've done hundreds of oral history interviews. I've never caught someone lying. Does that mean it never happens? But it's just, as a general rule, people don't lie. I think it's more common they might misremember, right? But any source from the historical record that we use is prone to errors. Newspapers, diaries, letters, they could all have mistakes or people misremembering things. And so as historians using any type of historical resource, we have to approach it with some skepticism and verify information across multiple sources and present it as the memory of so-and-so, right? So I love that you chose to use the oral histories, even though they may be an imperfect source. What source isn't?
Absolutely. One of the things that I do is I volunteer at a local museum in Pemberton, and we just got a box of 30 oral history tapes from the 1970s that were
Wow.
dropped off we didn't even know existed. They came from someone's closet, and they're all oral histories with people from the town. So I am very excited to continue working with oral histories in whatever way possible.
Awesome. Are they on cassettes?
They are on cassettes.
Let's sidebar because Tara Maharjan from the state archives just turned me on to this very inexpensive piece of equipment that will easily turn cassettes into digital files for you. We'll sidebar on that.
I think I just got one in.
Oh, did you? Awesome. Sorry, everybody else I'm talking nerd technology here. Other questions from the audience in our 4 remaining minutes? Just a comment here in the chat, not a question. I wanted to say how much I enjoyed this presentation. Excellent work. When do you defend your dissertation?
Thank you so much, Joe. That means a lot to me. I just finished my first year last year, so I still have some time. I have between 3 and 4 years left. And my prospective project, which is still apt to change, has to do with prisons and prison newspapers. Paul, who's in the call, has had to read way too much of my work, but I think I have a little bit of something that's a little tiny bit groundbreaking. So hopefully in 3 to 4 years, and we'll figure it out together.
And you're finding time to do all of this wonderful, meaningful work not related to your dissertation. Paulie, look at you.
Well, don't tell my advisors that.
Oh, well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. We are just about out of time. Is there anything else that you would like to add, Paulie, before we break?
I'll just say, I don't know if anyone here is from outside of New Jersey, but New Jersey history, in particular Pine Barrens history, has so much to offer to the state. When it comes to New Jersey history, sometimes the southern part of the state gets left behind, and I think that's a real tragedy. And for any of you that are, historians or want to be historians or are just interested in history, we need people that are interested in South Jersey history. So give it a shot. The worst thing that could happen is that you learn something fun.
Well, that is an absolutely perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Paulie. Thank you to everybody for joining us. And I hope you will all keep in touch. We've got lots of diverse events coming up, and we'd love to see you again. It's springsteenarchives.org, or you can find us on the social media of your choosing. Thanks so much, Paulie. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.